So I am giving this lecture now. This is number 131 on Mor Nevuchim, and I'm giving it from San Antonio, uh, where I'm doing this class for the Army. But fortunately, they gave me my own room, so I'm able to sit and give the class, and I don't have to run around looking for a place to do it. And so we are in the middle of chapter 48 in part 3 of the Rambam. And again, for those that just watching now, I'm using the all page references are to the Shlomo Pinas edition, volume 2. I'm currently on the top of page 599. However, I think I'm going to start from the beginning again, just so that we get the flow of the whole chapter. And he's the last several chapters he's been discussing his understanding of the logic behind the commandments of the Torah. He divided all the commandments of the Torah into 14 groups, and chapter 48 is discussing the commandments related to the 13th group. So I'm going to start reading on chapter 598, on page 598, chapter 48. The commandments comprised in the 13th class are those that we have enumerated in the laws concerning forbidden foods, in laws concerning slaughtering, and the laws concerning vows and Nazaritism. Right? So those are the laws that the Rambam put in the 13th class. And again, like I told you several times, this corresponds roughly to the books of the Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam wrote the laws, the laws in detail of all of these categories. So this category, we have already given an exhaustive and eloquent exposition of the utility of this class, right? But we shall add to the clarity of this explanation by examining closely, right? If you look back in 35, that's where he laid out the chapter 35. It's where he laid out the 14 categories. And each time he said a category, he said the basic reason for it. But now he's going to tell us, add to the clarity by examining closely the single commandments included therein. I'm going to look at the commandments as they appear in the Torah, and I'll tell you a little bit about each one. So we're going to go a little bit more into details. So I say then, so for starters, that to eat of any of the various kinds of food that the Torah has forbidden us is blameworthy. In other words, eating any of those foods is just no good for you, right? That's the bottom line. Right? And some of the other translations, it's more clear that blameworthy is, he's not talking about a spiritual blame. He just means it's a bad idea, meaning it's unhealthy. It's not good for you, right? And you'll see it in more detail as we go on. Among all those forbidden to us, only pork and fat may be imagined not to be harmful. You might think there are certain fats within the animal that were prohibited to eat, right? And roughly corresponds to organ fats like belly fat, things like that. But regardless, and pork, you might think that, well, why should that be different than any other meat? If you're allowed to eat cow's meat or sheep meat or goat's meat, what's the difference if it's a pig's meat? So you might think that. And the same thing with the fat. There's plenty parts of the fat that are permissible to eat. So if those fats are no good, well, then why would these fats be no good? That you might think that. But this is not so, for pork is more humid than is proper and contains much superfluous matter. He's basically saying that pork is inherently unhealthier, less healthy than other meats. The major reason why the Torah abhors it is because it's very dirty and it feeds on dirty things. It's because the pig is dirty and it wallows in the mud and it eats dirt and stuff like that. You know to what extent the Torah insists upon the need to remove filth out of sight, even in the field or in a military camp. The Torah is very careful to teach us the ideals of cleanliness and to keep dirt and filth away, and all the more within cities. Now, if swine were used for food, marketplaces and even houses would be dirtier than latrines, as may be seen at present in the country of the Franks, which is basically saying in Europe, right? Some of the other translations just translate it that way, as in Europe. But Rambam in Egypt would have called that the country of the Franks, because that was a general term for the Christians in the Muslim world. You know the dictum of the sages, may their memory be blessed. The mouth of a swine is like walking excrement. The fat of the intestines too makes us full, right? It spoils digestion and produces cold and thick blood. It is more. This is was a health belief that the Rambam shared with other doctors of his time. It is more suitable to burn it. Blood, on the other hand, and carcasses of beasts that have died on the other are also difficult to digest and constitute a harmful nourishment. So it is well known that a beast that is treifa, in other words, is that it's ill, that it has a sickness, that it's going to die from, is close to being a carcass. Eating from a carcass is dangerous, and that would be true even today. Obviously, a dead animal that's lying around is not safe to eat. Because once it starts to rot, you can just imagine on your own. With references to the signs, what about the signs that mark a permitted animal? That is, chewing the cud and divided hoofs in the case of beasts, and fins and scales in the case of fish. Know that their existence is not in itself a reason for the animals being permitted. In other words, an animal is not kosher because it has split hoofs and chews its cud, but rather nor is their absence a reason for animals being prohibited. Another animal is not prohibited, for example, a horse, because it has no split hooves, but rather there are signs by means of which the praised species may be discerned from the blamed species. The reasons why they're not kosher or are kosher is because, according to the Rambam's idea, they're either healthier or better for you, or they're cleaner, or they don't have the problems that pigs have. But it just so happens to be that how do you differentiate which species are which? By the signs that the Torah tells us how you differentiate. But that's not the reason for their being kosher. The reason why the sinew of the thigh vein is prohibited is given in the scriptural text. The Torah tells us why we don't eat that gid hanasha, the sciatic nerve, because it's because of the story of Jacob and his fight with the angel. The reason for the prohibition against eating a limb cut off, a living animal, is because this would make one acquire the habit of cruelty. That's the law. Sorry about that. Against Avram and Achai, against eating the limb of a living animal, because this in those days, in the days of the Gentiles, I'm at the top of page 599 now. This was also an action used in idolatry, meaning to cut off a limb from a beast and to eat it. So what about meat and milk? I think this is where we were up to last time. It is, in my opinion, not improbable. Now, I want to point this out, and I pointed this out several times, that it's very clear from the Rambam's language that he understands that these reasons, in some cases, might be convincing to the people reading them, and in some cases, the people reading them might have other reasons. His language is always, he will say, in my opinion, I think, I feel, I see, you know what I mean? Like, so you get the sense that he understood that these are not meant to be like necessarily meant to be rock solid, that like he wouldn't have gotten really angry if somebody came to him later and said, wait, I think I disagree, and I tell you, and convinced him otherwise, right? He understood that these are suggestions as opposed to just the way he writes it. It just gives you that impression. But anyway, it is not improbable that in addition to this being undoubtedly very gross food, the gross, he's using it in the sense of disgusting. You have to look at some of the other translations, and very filling. To him, the idea that if you eat a small amount of food and you feel full, right, then that is a sign that the food is not good for you, right? Because in the way the way the doctors of the day saw it was a food that you digest easily and they break down to its constituent parts easily. That's a food that's inherently more healthier for you. Whereas a food that you eat a little bit and you feel full. Now, in modern science, we know that when you eat foods that are full of fat, they satiate you faster, and that's impossible. That could be that whatever. Regardless, it's hard to compare what they thought to what we thought. But the bottom line is in mind, because they were filling, they're bad for you. So, and also idolatry, it's not improbable that idolatry had something to do with it. Perhaps such food was eaten at one of the ceremonies of their cult or at one of their festivals. A confirmation of this may, in my opinion, be found in the fact, and you might see a hint of this, my idea, right, that the prohibition against eating meat and milk, when it is mentioned the first two times in the Torah, it occurs near the commandment concerning pilgrimage. It says 3 times a year you go to the Beis HaMikdash, and then it says, Lo sibashel gedi b'chalev imo, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, from which we derive this idea of not eating meat and milk together, right? So it is as if it said, when you go to pilgrimage to the house of the Lord, do not cook there in the way they used to. In other words, don't do that which you used to do when you were doing pilgrimaging to the houses of idol worship. According to me, this is the most probable view regarding the reason for this prohibition. It seems to be, if you haven't noticed already, that this is the Rambam's kind of catch-all reason for almost anything that seems otherwise to be difficult to understand. He'll explain that, well, that's because they were practicing these things for the idols, and therefore God didn't want us to do it, and because he wanted to show that worshiping God is different, right? And not to do the kinds of things they used to do with the idols. Regarding this, but I have not seen this set down in any of the books of the Sabians that I have read. In other words, I haven't yet, in my historical research into the practices of the pre-monotheistic pagan religions in the Middle East, I haven't yet found any evidence that people used to cook meat and milk. But I think they're probably, if you keep looking, you'll probably find that is what the Rambam is thinking. I don't know if anyone has done more research on this subject or not, but I guess it would be interesting if we found that it really was a pagan custom. It will certainly back up the Rambam's assertion here. But anyway, the commandment concerning the slaughtering of animals is necessary. The idea that we have to slaughter them properly in a specific way prior to eating them. For the natural food of man consists only of the plants deriving from the seeds growing in the earth and of the flesh of animals, right? The most excellent kinds of meat being those that are permitted to us. Again, he's asserting that the meat that is permitted is also the healthiest meat for us. It's what we need for our nutrition. No physician is ignorant of this. Every doctor, Rambam is saying, understands that we need these proper, healthy kinds of meat, plus fruits and vegetables that grow from the earth, right? Now, this necessity to have good food requires that animals be killed. Obviously, we have to kill them. But if that's the case, the Rambam is saying here, in other words, we really shouldn't, it's not good that we should have to kill them at all. But human nutrition requires that we need it, right? People, it won't, it's because it was understood back then that for human nutrition, animals were required. They needed it. They needed it as a source of iron and protein or whatever, right? So the aim was, if you have to kill them, the aim is to kill them in the easiest manner, and it was forbidden to torment them through killing them in a reprehensible manner by piercing the lower part of their throat or cutting off one of their limbs, just as we have explained. So the Torah prescribes to us a way to kill them that's quick and easy and involves the least amount of suffering to the animal. So that makes sense. So here he's explaining the reason for the mitzvah of slaughtering animals and only eating them when they were properly slaughtered. It is likewise forbidden to slaughter it and its young on the same day. We're not allowed to kill an animal and its young, its baby, on the same day. This being a precautionary measure, it's there to remind us in order to avoid slaughtering the young animal in front of its mother. Because if we were allowed to do that, then we may slaughter the baby in front of its mother. And in these cases, animals feel very great pain. For there is no difference regarding this pain between man, human beings, and other animals. The love and tenderness of a mother for her child is not consequent upon reason. It doesn't come from our logical faculty. It's upon the activity of the imaginative faculty. It's something we feel in our emotions, which is found in most animals just as it is found in man. Animals also feel emotions. They also feel love for their baby. And to slaughter a baby in front of its mother would cause her terrible, terrible pain. So in order to teach us this and prevent us from doing this, the Torah says not to kill the mother and its baby on the same day. This law applies in particular to an ox and a lamb. The reason why it mentions it regarding those specific species, because these are the domestic animals that we're allowed to eat. And in most cases, it is usual to eat. In their case, the mother can be differentiated from her young, right? So that we know that, and therefore we know this is the mother, this is the baby. We should stay away from doing that kind of an act. This is also the reason for the commandment. This is the same thing. This is also the reason for the commandment to let the mother go from the nest, right? There is a commandment in the Torah. There's a lot of literature about this. But it's the mitzvah of shiluach hakein, where if you see a mother bird sitting on eggs and you want to eat the eggs, you have to send the mother away and make sure she's gone before you take the eggs, right? And in general, the eggs over which, first of all, he says, the eggs over which the bird has sat and the young that need their mother are not fit to be eaten. If you find a bird and she's sitting on eggs, usually you can't eat them, right? If then the mother is let go and escapes of her own accord, she will not be pained by seeing that the young are taken away. Or at least that's the idea, right? In most cases, this will lead to people leaving everything alone, right? For what may be taken is in most cases not fit to be eaten. So in other words, number one, you're going to send the mother away, and then you're going to look and you're going to say, you know what, I'm not really interested in this, right? The mother's sitting on the eggs, right? And then you look and you see that either they're babies already and there's really nothing to eat, so you'll leave them alone, so she'll come back. So the Rambam is saying, like, one of the purposes of the mitzvah is in order that you shouldn't actually take the eggs, right? Right, in order that you shouldn't actually take the babies, right? And if you do, right, then at least you did it not in front of her, right? But the bottom line is this is not the first time where he said something similar, right? That the point of a mitzvah is in order to prevent you from actually doing that which is that you set out to do. So if the Torah takes into consideration these pains of the soul in the case of the beast and birds, right? The Torah understood that we have to recognize that animals, including birds, have emotion and feelings, right? And we should be sensitive to those feelings, and not just physical pain, but emotional pain, right? Of watching her babies being taken or killed, right? What will be the case with regard to the individuals of the human species as a whole? Can you imagine how much more serious it is when we don't pay attention to the feelings and emotions of other people and hurt them? You must not allege but now you're going to want to ask me a question, right? There's the Mishnah in Brachos, right? In the Tractate Brachos records a disagreement, right, over whether or not the reason of this mitzvah is just a decree without a reason, right? Or is it a decree in order for us to have mercy on the bird, right? So, and that's how the Mishnah reads in Brachos. It brings two opinions there. And one would try to, it would seem that the Rambam is coming down very strong on one side. And the Rambam is going to say that very clearly, right? So remember, the Rambam had stated that he is specifically writing this entire section because he disagrees with those thinkers who say that mitzvot don't have reasons and we're not supposed to look for the reasons for the mitzvot. Remember, many argue, right, that we shouldn't look for reasons, and they have a pretty reasonable argument. They'll tell you, well, once you start saying, well, this is the reason why God told us to do this, so now this doesn't apply, so I'll go do what I want, right? And then the whole Torah falls apart. So no, it's the reason is something spiritual, something higher, something that we don't necessarily understand. We do it because God told us to, right? Now remember, the Rambam specifically rejected that opinion and went ahead to write this entire section because he rejects that opinion. So now he's telling you one of the places where the Gemara discusses this specifically, this issue, is with relationship to this mitzvah of sending away the mother bird. So you're going to try to object to me by telling me about what it says, because the dictum of the sages, he who, may their memory be blessed, he who says, thy mercy extendeth to young birds, and so on. You have to look at that Mishnah there in Brachot. The Rambam explicitly says, and this is really interesting, for this is one of the two opinions mentioned by us meaning by the Jewish scholars, right? I mean, the opinion of those who think that there is no reason for the Torah except the will of God. But as for us, meaning me, the Rambam, and those that are following this book, we follow this only the second opinion. In other words, I reject that opinion that the Gemara stated. So what we're seeing here is really fascinating, because this is an important philosophical issue, and two legitimate opinions are expressed in the Talmud, and the Rambam comes down hard on one side and rejects the other, right? So, if you were to extend this, right, that would mean that when there's a disagreement over something that's non-halachic, and we see this in the Rambam and other places, but this is the most blatant of them all. When there's a disagreement over an issue that has to do with a non-halachic matter, right? Everyone agrees to the extent the Jewish law, the law that the Torah says that you have to send away the mother before you take the eggs. The disagreement is over the interpretation and the meaning of it, right? So whenever you have such a disagreement, if it's not if it's a disagreement over a practical thing, like what we're supposed to do, you need to decide based on the rules of the Talmud which opinion we go according to. But if it's a great disagreement over a philosophical issue, right, or a non-halachic issue, then we are allowed to take one opinion over the other if that's the one that seems to make more sense to us, right? Right, which is exactly what the Rambam is doing. He's saying, I don't like that other opinion. I like this opinion, and I'm not going according to that opinion. I'm going according to this one. So therefore, this has a lot of ramifications for a lot of discussions that many of us may have had with people. If you're debating someone a subject and they pull out a Gemara and they say, "Oh, look what the Talmud says over here," but if there's a dissenting opinion, you have no obligation when it comes to a non-halachic matter. I'm making that clear several times. When it comes to a non-halachic matter, you're not obligated to go according to that opinion. You can go according to the other opinion, right? It's okay. You're allowed to do that, right? And that's exactly what the Rambam is doing here. We have already drawn attention to the fact that the Torah itself set the reason. So he's continuing now at the second paragraph, right? The reason of the covering blood, it applies particularly to clean wild beasts and clean birds. Remember the covering of the blood issue, because he started talking about shechita, right? Slaughtering the animal, so covering blood. But remember that he discussed that in detail a couple chapters ago when he discussed the issue of blood and how blood was used in pagan practice or worships. We don't have to go into that now, right? That was just a couple chapters ago. Besides the ordinances given to us concerning the prohibition of forbidden food, right? Ordinances have also been prescribed us with regard to the vows. The Rambam classified vows in this thing because vows are usually related to. They could be related to anything. I mean, you could take a vow that I'm not going to run around the parking lot tomorrow, right? But or that you will or whatever. But but usually vows are related to something that people consume, so he put it all in that same category, right? So vows are typically, I'm not going to eat, you want to lose weight, you take a vow, I've been eating too much. I'm not going to eat, Twinkies or I don't know, whatever, cupcakes anymore tomorrow, whatever it is that you're not going to eat. Right. So whenever a man says this bread or this meat is forbidden to me, it is forbidden to him to eat it. All this being training with the view to achieving temperance and to restraining the appetite for eating and drinking. The purpose of a vow and the reason why we're obligated to keep them is in order to train ourselves, right, to abstain from things that we don't need and to train ourselves to stay away from bad things. Now, remember, in this chapter, what we're about to read, and later, the next chapter, especially 49, his attitude and his understanding of the of women is not at all close to today, and I can't help that. And we're just going to read the Rambam and just have to take it for as it is, because that's what it is. And he was reflecting the beliefs of his time, and it doesn't justify them, but it is what it is. I can't change them. So, as women are prone to anger, being easily affected, and having weak souls, there would have been grave troubles, quarrels, and disorder in the house if their oaths had been under their control, right? Because there's a law that if a woman who's married, right, makes an oath, her husband is allowed to abolish that oath. That's what the Torah said. For a certain kind, if she says, I'm not going to eat bread, and she doesn't want to eat bread, would have been permitted for the husband and forbidden for the wife, or another again forbidden for the daughter and permitted for the mother. Therefore, the matter with everything pertaining to it is given into the charge of the master of the house. He had a very male-centric view of how the family is structured, and that's how it was. So do you not see that a woman who is governed by herself and not dependent upon the control of the master's house has, with regard to vows, the same status as a man? If she's not living in a home with a man, if she's on her own, then she has every right to make whatever vows she wants and rule the house however she wants. But when she's living with the guy, he's the boss over what's permitted and what's prohibited in that house to eat. I refer to a woman who has no husband and no father, or has arrived at the age of puberty. I mean, one that is of age, right? Obviously, a child isn't responsible to keep their vows because they're not responsible for their actions yet. So that was his. So therefore, vows. And now, an extension of vows is they always go along with the idea of being a Nazirite, being a Nazir, because a Nazir he takes a vow, or she takes a vow, right? It's a vow not to, not to drink wine, whatever, all the various rules of a Nazir. So it's in the same category. So the reason for that is also most manifested, consistent, bringing about abstinence from drinking wine. And this, I think, we can all relate to. It was true back then and it's true now, which has caused the ruin of the ancients and the moderns for another 1,000 years after him. Many, yea, a mighty host have been slain by it, but these have erred through wine, and so on. There's many verses throughout Tanakh that reflect the danger of drinking wine and getting too hooked on alcohol. The prohibition you see against eating anything that cometh of the grapevine results from the law regarding Nazaritism, being an additional measure that he's not allowed to eat anything even close to wine, even anything that comes from a grape, with the view to the avoidance of wine, so that people should content themselves with no more of it than is necessary. Okay, drink a little, fine, but that's it. But a Nazir takes upon himself to stay away from wine completely in order to train himself to stay away. For whoever avoids it is called holy and is put in the same rank as the high priest as far as holiness is concerned. Avoiding too much alcohol is important. I think that's we can still relate to. So that, like the latter, he may not render himself unclean through contact with a corpse, right? Even that of his father and his mother, because he has the holiness of a high priest. And remember, we discussed why a high priest has to do that in the chapter where we discussed holiness. I think that was last week or the week before. Although all this high esteem is given to him because he abstains from drink. We honor somebody who refuses to drink alcohol, and that is that. So that completes the subject of forbidden foods, with a lot of very important things. And one of the, and just a reminder, that issue with the sending away the mother bird, about Rambam's approach to Agada and the reason for the mitzvot. If anyone has any comments on chapter 48, before I go on to 49, I'm going to open the floor. Any questions, comments, observations? If not, I'm going to go on to 49. Now, 49 is pretty long, very long. So there's no way we're going to finish it tonight. There's a lot of interesting things in 49, and we're going to have to take off our modern hat when it comes to our understanding of women, because there's going to be a lot of the similar stuff that we just read today. So we're just going to have to put on 1,000-year-old hat and see it in that regard. So the commandments included in the 14th class are those that we have enumerated in the Book of Women and the Laws and Prohibit Sexual Relations. So that's again referring to books in his Mishnah Torah and his halachic code. So now he's going to take, this is the last category, and he's going to discuss those laws in detail. And also it includes the interbreeding of beasts, right? And the commandment of circumcision. Why the Rambam puts bris milah and circumcision into this category, we'll understand when he explains his understanding of the reasons of circumcision, which he looks at. The Rambam considers that a sexual thing. Obviously, it's on a sexual organ, it's on the penis, but you don't necessarily need to understand the reason for circumcision as being something sexual, but the Rambam does, and we'll see that. I doubt we'll get there this week, but it will be in chapter 49. The purpose of this class of commandments has already been reported. In other words, I already told you again, and back in chapter 35, I think it was, right, what the basic reasons for these things were. But now I'll go into the particulars. Now let's talk about the basic, let's go into the details of the different mitzvot that have to do with illicit relationships, marriage, divorce, anything sexual. So I say then, it is well known that friends are something that is necessary for man throughout his whole life. Human beings are social animals. We need company. We need friends, right? Aristotle has set this forth in the 9th book of the Ethics, where he describes it at length, right? For in a state of health and happiness, a man takes pleasure in their familiar relationship with him. In adversity, he has recourse to them, and in his old age, when his body has grown weak, he seeks their help. Right? We form bonds with other human beings. We develop families, social groups, communities, right? Because we rely on each other for all kinds of things, for friendship itself, and for the practical benefits we get from having friends. So the same things may be found to a much greater extent in the relationship with one's children and relationship with one's relatives, right? Our close family, we develop even deeper relationships and have an even more profound and deep need for our close family relations, right? For fraternal sentiments and mutual love and mutual help can be found in their perfect form only among those who are related by their ancestry. When we develop familial bonds and we have ancestral relationships, we're married, we have children, parents, etc., it creates a, a bond that is very difficult, if not impossible, to make with people that are not related, right? Accordingly, remember, it's not really the time now to sit and debate whether you agree with this or not. We're just learning how the Rambam understands the reason, right? But if you don't agree with it, that's fine. You're allowed to disagree, but this is the Rambam talking. So accordingly, a single tribe that is united through a common ancestor, even if he is remote, because of this, love one another and help one another and have pity on one another. It was understood, that people that have a similar descent from a similar an ancestor, right? They share what we would call today, DNA and genetics or whatever. The older times we would have said they share mutual blood or however you look at it. So there's a natural tendency to care about people that were related to more than people that were not related to. And the attainment of these things is the greatest purpose of the law. Hence, harlots are prohibited. We are not allowed to engage in harlotry. What's the word I'm looking for? Prostitution, right? Because through them, lines of ancestry are destroyed. If people would be having sexual intercourse with many people that are not don't have familial bonds, so we end up creating communities where people are not related to each other, right? And if we're not related to each other, for a child born of them is a stranger to the people. No one knows to what family group he belongs, and no one in his family group knows him. And this is the worst of conditions for him and for his father, right? So you end up making a mess. Another important consideration comes in as a reason for the prohibition of harlots, right? It is also prohibited for another reason. This is the prevention of an intense lust for sexual intercourse and constant preoccupation with it. If the business of prostitution is allowed, then people get involved in it and they get stuck with it and they keep doing it, and it ends up having a promiscuous society, and people are preoccupied with sex, and it just ruins the society. For lust is increased through the change of the individuals that are harlots, right? People that are harlots, right, or prostitutes, are going to advertise their wares, what they're selling, and so you end up with streets where the environment is not good, right? So they themselves change themselves in such a way that increase the people's desire for it. And for man is not stirred in the same way by individuals to whom he has been continuously accustomed as by individuals who are constantly renewed and who differ in shapes and manners. I want this kind of woman, I want that kind of woman, I want this kind of experience. That he ends up in the prohibition of harlots. There is very great utility, namely the prevention of evils. For if they were permitted, a number of men might happen to betake themselves at one and the same time to one woman. They would inevitably, and then what happens when two men they each like this woman, and then they start to fight, they inevitably quarrel. In most cases, they would kill one another or kill the woman, right? Right? They'd kill one another, or they'd get angry at the woman for going with the other guy and they'd kill her, right? So it just begets violence, a thing that constantly happens as they assemble in troops at a prostitute's house. As is a verse that he's quoting from Jeremiah. In order to prevent these great evils and to bring about this common utility, namely knowledge of the lines of ancestry. Number one, that family, it should be known whose family is who. So harlots and male prostitutes are prohibited, and there is no way to engage in permitted sexual intercourse other than through singling out a woman for oneself and marrying her in public, right? Through making a public ceremony where this is my wife and I'm her husband and we're married, and that's how you're supposed to have sex. Now, mind you that this reflects very closely Rambam's understanding of the pasuk, right? Of what the prohibition of a kedesha, what the prohibition of a harlot, a prostitute is. The Rambam understands prostitution to be a Torah prohibition, and he's consistent with that in his halacha and Mishnah Torah. And here, it is not completely agreed upon by all halachic poskim that that's necessarily the case, but it doesn't matter. We're learning the Rambam now. I mean, no one looks positively on prostitution, but whether or not it is an actual Torah prohibition is not 100% as clear as the Rambam is making it. But this is consistent with his own opinion, so it's totally cool that he's saying this. So, for if it sufficed merely to single her out, most men would bring a harlot to their house for a certain time, having made an agreement with her about this, and say that she is a wife, right? If it has to be a marriage in public and a thing, why? Because if all it is that it's just you're supposed to be with just one woman, so the guy would say, okay, I'll find this woman, I'll make her a deal. I'll pay you X, you'll be my wife for a month, right? And then he'll kick her out, right? And then she'll go on to the next guy for another month. So therefore, a binding ceremony and a certain act have been prescribed, signifying that the woman is allotted to the man. This is the betrothal. We make it into a public thing. We make a whole ceremony out of it. So everybody knows that this is a couple. Then when the act is made in public, it is a ceremony of marriage, and Boaz took 10 men and so on. That has to be done in the presence of a minyan, right, of 10 men. Sometimes the union of the two may be discordant and matters in their house in a good order, but it's true. Occasionally it doesn't work out, right? They get into a fight, they can't live together. So consequently, divorce is permitted. However, divorce too, it's not just, it has to be done. If a divorce could be valid merely by means of utterance of words, and here he's directly referring to the Islamic custom, because to this day, if I'm not mistaken, in Islam, all divorce consists of is a statement, right? And in some very conservative Islamic societies, that's all they need to do, tell their wife goodbye, and then that's the end. So, but in Torah, Rama is saying, no, it has to be something much more than that. So, or through the man's turning the woman out of his house, or if he just kicks her out, that's enough, she's divorced. The woman might watch for some negligence on the part of her husband and then go out and claim to be divorced, right? If that was all it took, then she could walk out and claim it would be a mixed. Or if some individual had fornicated with her, she and the adulterer might claim that she had been divorced beforehand. So therefore, the Torah gave us the ordinance that a divorce can only be made by valid by a means of a writ attested to it. Right? It has to be written as a document, and you shall write her a bill of divorcement, and so on, so that it's real. Everyone knows. And if she's trying to make it up, she can't. She has to be able to produce a valid signed document attesting to the divorce. Okay. As accusations of adultery and imaginings concerned with it are very frequent with regard to women, because in our society, the Rambam is saying in his day, right, people are constantly accusing women of whether they're imaginings or accusing or real, who knows, but people are always yelling that their wives are not faithful. So this I think is still probably true. Accusations, everyone, when you start getting into a fight, people yell, you did this, you did that, you cheated, you didn't cheat. So the Torah gave us ordinances concerning the woman who is suspected of adultery. The Torah then tells us what to do in a case when someone suspects a woman of adultery, his wife of adultery. These ordinances oblige every married woman to take extreme care in her behavior. And yes, I know this does put a lot of onus on her and not a lot on him, but like I said, I'm not addressing that. To have recourse to the greatest precautions, lest the heart of her husband be incensed on her account, right? So she has to be really careful to watch out what she does so that he doesn't suspect her. For she anticipates with apprehension the horror of the waters of the woman suspected of adultery. The whole process of the drinking the water is a very painful, embarrassing, and dangerous process. If she is pure and safeguarded herself, then most men would give everything they possess in order to be liberated from having to make her undergo this procedure. They would even prefer death to this great shame, which consists in uncovering the woman's head, undoing her hair, tearing her garments so that her heart is exposed, and making her go around throughout the whole sanctuary in the presence of the public, right? So, in the presence of the great court of law, through these apprehensions, grave evils have been cut short that would have destroyed the order of a certain number of households. So, because people are nervous about this whole thing, both she nervous about going through it and he nervous about going through it, so he'll be more careful from making accusations, and she'll be more careful not to incite him to accuse her of such. Um, you know, okay. So therefore, the Torah gave us those laws. As every girl who is a virgin is set for marriage with the first man that happens along. So now he is going to be talking about the law of one who seduces a young girl, right? So her seducer is not only obliged to marry her, for he is the one who is most suitable for her, and this indubitably makes better repair for the flaw in her than her marrying another man, because now she has a flaw. Again, you have to look at this from the perspective of the time that he was living, right, and the time the Torah was given, that a woman who was no longer a virgin had this flaw. So since he's the one who made that happen, he's the one that should marry her, rather than someone else should get a woman who has that flaw. If, however, she or her father does not wish this, then the seducer must pay a dowry. Then you have to pay the father, right? There is additional punishment for a man who has raped a girl, that he's never allowed to put her away all his days. He's never allowed to divorce her. He's going to get into that in a little bit later as to what kind of sense that might make. I'm going to stop for a minute just because I need to catch my breath and ask if there's any questions or comments. If there isn't, I'm just taking a drink of water.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So if she decided to marry him and then later wanted to divorce him, would she have that option?
Well, according to Torah law, she never has the option, right? It's always that she can ask him for a divorce, but he has to give it from willingly,
Yeah.
right?
So
So
would he have to, if she later, he's not allowed to, no, because he's not allowed to give her one.
he's
So
not
she
allowed to
wouldn't
give her
even,
one.
if she later, yeah, so even later, if she wanted to, she's kind of stuck with him too, if
Basically,
she
yeah.
changed her mind. Yeah.
I mean, it's a difficult verse, and it's difficult to understand and explain. But I do want to say one thing on that count, and that is that the Rambam here, even though it's very hard in 2025 to relate to what he's saying, because the world is very different, and the way we understand and appreciate women and men and relationships is very, very different, to say the least. The one thing that I will say, though, is that the Rambam is attempting to use his understanding of how people work, right? Even though it's extremely different from ours, and we would look at him and pretty negatively if some guy would get up and say this today, right? But he is looking for a way to try to understand the Torah logically, right? Which is something that we should still do. And there are attempts to understand this logically. One of the ways is a method that the Rambam himself has used several times, is understanding the context of the world and the reality that they lived in when these laws were given, right? And if you think about it from that perspective, then it becomes, remember, women in those days did not had very limited, almost no ability to earn a living on their own, right? If they weren't married, right, they really were basically impoverished, to say the least, right? And it was a very different world. The difference, the concept of a woman having real autonomy was just non-existent. The idea that a woman is responsible to make sure not to incite her husband is something that today is abhorrent. I would never say such a thing. I would never think such a thing. But in the Rambam's day, that's the way people thought, right? And certainly in the time when the Torah was given, that's just the way people thought. So it's hard. It's tough. It's tough to read these things. But there are more modern thinkers who have given different explanations for this, and the only thing that I get from this is not really the Rambam's explanation, but the idea that he's looking for one. That he's trying to logically explain it. And that to me is what's important, not so much his actual explanation. I don't know if that makes sense, but um, that's really what I gained from almost all of these discussions. Obviously, there's many of these explanations that were really interesting and nice, and they certainly help us. But many of them just don't work for us, today. But that's fine, that's okay. But he's giving us not just permission, but he's telling us to do this on our own, to look for and to understand the Torah. He gave us permission to use historical context, which is crucial. I mean, there's many people today that you can bump into in the street, especially in the ultra orthodox world, right? That would think you're a heretic if you told them you can look at the Torah and understand the mitzvah based on the context within which it was given, right? But the Rambam explicitly told us that over and over again, that if we want to understand the Torah, we have to understand the world as it was when the Torah was given, right? And that many of these mitzvot are simply given only because of the practices of the world in which they were given, right? And it's be the same thing here, you know. Remember, I shall say this when the Torah of Hashem, which was prescribed to Moshe Rabbeinu, to whom in consequence it is described, can fulfill all the things may perhaps imagine to involve unpleasantness. I'm reading on page 592. We read this I think 2 weeks ago, right? They may seem to be unpleasant or have a heavy burden only because you do not know the usages and teachings that existed in those days. It behooves you to compare a rite in which, for reasons of divine worship, a man, and so on and so forth, compare it with and then he goes on. This is a premise of great importance that must not be lost from your mind, right? So the same way the Rambam applied it to the time that the Torah was given, we would be consistent in applying it to the time the Rambam was writing, right? We have to understand the Rambam's writing in a completely different world, and to judge him based on our own sensitivities would just be wrong, right? But we can learn his method and learn a lot from the way he understands this to come to different conclusions that might make more sense to us. And probably in a couple hundred years from now, or maybe a couple decades from now, people might look at our interpretations as being wrong or contextualized only, making sense only in the context that we live in today. So let's go on. So this chapter 49, like I said, it's a really long one. We're not going to finish it today, but hopefully we will finish it next week. Even that I'm not sure, but this is the last one in which he goes into the reasons for the commandments. And then the last 6 chapters, 50 through 55, are really his conclusion. And we have a lot of really nice stuff to go. Even though we're almost done, there's still a lot of really cool stuff to come. So as for the reason for the levirate, right? That is the yibum, the levirate marriage, right? The one that a woman must marry her husband's brother if they die without children. I'll do this one quickly, and then we'll conclude this week. It is literally stated in Scripture that this was an ancient custom that obtained before the giving of the Torah, right? It's clear from the verses in the Torah itself, right, that this is something that was practiced before the Torah was given, and that was perpetuated by the Torah, which the Rambam is hinting to right now. It may not make sense to you now, but the Torah was basically endorsing a practice that had been practiced for a long time. It was just saying that continuing to apply that same rule. As for what about the ceremony of taking off the shoe, right? And the chalitza, which is what happens when one does not want to marry his brother's widow, right? So the reason for it is to be found in the fact that the actions of which it is composed were considered shameful, right? The things that they were doing, taking off your shoe and spitting on the shoe and those things, right? According to the custom of those times, and on account of this, the brother-in-law might perhaps wish to avoid this shame, because those were shameful things that in those days, I think still in Middle Eastern societies, many of them, throwing your shoe or something is considered a real sign of disdain for something. So it kind of, I guess maybe that's just a continuation of the same. Maybe it has origins in the same thing, but he would be very ashamed to do that, to take off his shoes. So it might perhaps wish to avoid this shame and consequently marry his brother's widow. This is made manifest in the text of the Torah. So shall it be done unto this man, and so on. You can see it's clear from the verses that this was something that was shameful back then, and his name shall be called in Israel. People should call it, make it public. Again, shaming the person for not doing what he should have done, which is marry his brother's widow. The next one is pretty long, so I can't really start it. It's going to take a bit. So I think this is a good stopping point, and I guess we'll open the floor for a few minutes before we close up for tonight. Anyone have anything else to say?
Yeah, so I wanted to go back to the pain for animals. In other words, slaughtering animals and the pain and avoiding pain.
Right.
What do you think Rambam would say if they found a method of killing animals that was not as the kosher method, but was definitely found to have less pain than the method that we do to kill animals in a kosher manner?
Right.
What would Rambam have said about that? What do you think would have happened?
I'm not going to speak for the Rambam. I don't know.
Well, what do you think? Well, let me ask you, what do you think in terms of that?
I don't think he would have abolished shechita, because the Rambam says that shechita is chosen because it's quick and painless. He didn't say it was quick and the least possible painless way, right? But in general, so it is a method of very quick and reasonably painless. It's not painless. No one will argue that shechita is painless. I've seen shechita happen, and it's definitely not painless, right?
Okay.
But it is quick, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think he would have said, because the Rambam in general is very quick to explain reasons for mitzvot, right? By explaining them in historical context, right? Which I talked about a bunch tonight and many times, right?
Yeah.
But he never says, therefore, we should change the halacha because of a different historical context, right? This is my backing for why I say what the Rambam would have said, right? Right? He never says, Yibam, for example, was given because that was what people did in those days. But nowadays, people don't do it anymore, so we shouldn't do it. He doesn't say that, right?
Right.
He says the Torah stays, the rules and laws stay, right? And we've been through this a few times. I think you've asked these questions before, right? That even though the reason for, let's say, kilayim, like not mixing wool and linen, originates in the pagan custom of mixing wool and linen, right? Nowadays, as far as I know, there's no such pagan custom, unless like you can find that for me somewhere in the world. But as far as I know, it's not, certainly not in America. There's no pagan custom of mixing wool and linen, right? But we still don't do it because, so nowadays we just have to say, okay, I'm not doing it because it reminds me of the importance of not doing pagan things, right? So that would be a logical reason why I continue. But the Rambam never said, you know what, now we shouldn't bother with wool and linen anymore, right? Right? We still, the halacha still stands, even though the reason might have fallen away. So the same thing, I think, he would have applied to shechita. Yes, shechita was given to us because of the fact that that it's quick and painless, right? But I don't think he would have changed the law. I really don't believe so. I mean, some may argue that he would have. I don't know, but I don't buy that. He's been pretty consistent with keeping halacha, forever. I mean, he wrote the Mishnah Torah, right, with the expectation that we would keep halacha. So I doubt he would have changed it. I hope that's a good enough answer.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I hit a button and lost you. So
Oh, no, that's okay. But I would say I would make another argument. Remember that the Rambam felt and he wrote that all the physicians agree, right, that people need to kill the animals for health purposes. And therefore, the Torah said, because we need to eat them, right, therefore, we should have, and because we obviously have to kill them, we should do it in as pain-free a way as possible, right? And he certainly would have agreed that we should treat them during their lifetimes in as pain-free and as humane a way as possible, right? There's no question he would have agreed. And when you read about what he talks about, how animals have feelings and emotions just like human beings do, there's no question that, and animals feel pain, etc. The question that I would pose to you, and this is because I'm a vegan, right, is what would the Rambam have said if he knew for a fact, like we now know, that we no longer need to eat animals, right? Right?
right.
There are many Orthodox Jewish vegans like myself who make the argument from the Rambam, from this part of the Rambam, plus other things the Rambam have said, that nowadays he would certainly support. Now we do not need to eat animals anymore. There's no question from a medical perspective that it's completely unnecessary for us to eat meat, right? It's been established in study after study after study. So,
Right.
so nowadays, it may very well be that in those days they didn't need to eat meat because they didn't have access to all the fruits and vegetables that we have today. But nowadays that we have them and we know how to get everything we need from fruits and vegetables, we don't need meat anymore. He may have said, you know what, this pain might not be worthwhile anymore, right? There's a lot of places within the Rambam that would support that argument, but that's not what you asked me. But I had
Well,
to put
that's a good segue to that.
right. But I had
yeah,
to put in a plug. I'm sorry, but
I knew it was coming.
yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. But the thing is that you're right. With the exception of vitamin B12, you probably can get away with it. But you got to get vitamin B12 from someplace.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that too, but there are ways to get that from plants as well.
Oh, really? I'd be interesting. Later, I'll talk with you about
Yeah,
that.
we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's just, yeah, my B12 levels have been perfect over the last several years.
And you don't take a supplement. You don't take a vitamin supplement. Oh, okay.
I know how to get it. I mean, it's fortified, whatever. It's totally off subject. Everyone here doesn't need to listen to this now.
No, I'm saying I want them to read about it. Not now.
Okay.
Not now.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Next time I'm in shul, we'll talk about it.
Okay.
All right. Anyway, it won't be for a few weeks because I'm stuck in Texas for a bit. But anyway, everyone, if there are any other questions before we sign off for the night.
I just wanted to say, is it appropriate to send a student's project? There's these two students, I think, in California, and they play these two girls, these two aliens abducted these two men, and they promised them that they'll after they give them information about the human race, they'll return them to the house, and then when he messes up and says that his jacket is made out of leather, they leave them on some kind of stranded. Right. I'll send it to you. You can decide if you.
All right, I'll let you know. All right, everybody. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. Next week, we'll continue.
Be careful not
to. Thank you, Saul.
So remember that Texas is the end of the earth. So be careful if you might step off the edge of the earth.
Okay, I'll be careful. I'll watch out for it.
Watch out for the end of the earth because that's where Texas is. So, all right.